In 1882, the British Prime Minister William Gladstone ordered the occupation of Egypt in an effort to overthrow its erratic nationalist government, high-handedly claiming a mandate to reorganise the country's disastrous finances. The operation was swift, an Egyptian army was quickly routed, and the road to Cairo was opened. The Egyptian monarch, who had recently been ousted by the nationalists, was restored nominally as a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, though de facto as a British client. The campaign was superficially then a success. Britain had restored order to Egypt, saved her investments in the country, and secured the Suez Canal, the vital waterway connecting Britain to her Eastern Empire. But diplomatically, Gladstone's rash decision had been catastrophic. The French, who had taken part in an initial show of force with Britain, were furious at the occupation. They also had large investments in Egypt and the Suez Canal, which was now under the control of their rival. Whitehall claimed the occupation was temporary, but it quickly became apparent that once the British garrison left, any constitutional reforms would be undone and the Khedive once again deposed. Yet, so long as British forces remained in Egypt, France remained an intractable foe, putting relentless pressure on the empire's already overstretched resources. This left Britain dependent on German and Austrian diplomatic support so as to not be completely alienated from the concert of Europe. The German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, was happy to oblige and remained conspicuously silent on the Egyptian issue. But it was always in the knowledge that so long as Britain had troops in Cairo, Germany would be able to extract concessions in other areas as a price for its support. In 1884, Bismarck did just that and forced Britain into retreat over a number of colonial claims in Africa. With Gladstone leaving office having finally achieved his cherished aim of uniting Europe in common cause, a cause that just happened to be a mutual disdain of England, the man left with the task of steering Britain away from this most perilous of international positions, not known since the Treaties of Tilsit, was a tall, short-sighted, badly dressed and fatalistic aristocrat of 56 years. Yet the Marquess of Salisbury, who took the premiership for the second time in 1886, was one of the most formidable intellectual minds to ever form a government. A practitioner of informal empire, he had criticised the decision to occupy Egypt, but once in power, quickly surmised Britain couldn't leave the country without it damaging her prestige and diplomatic hand further. Instead, he would have to secure Britain's position in the Near East from its then total dependence on German goodwill, doing this while simultaneously reckoning with the hostility of France, meaning potential conflicts over Madagascar, Morocco, as well as East and West Africa. It was an enormous task, yet what followed was several years of the most patient but brilliant diplomacy in European history. Salisbury began by placing trust in Britain's commissioner in Egypt, Evelyn Baring, who dominated the government in Cairo on a de facto basis. By 1888, Baring had completely transformed Egyptian finances. As Paul Hayes notes, the elimination of all deficits in 1888 greatly eased pressure on Britain in two ways. First, the financial burden to the British taxpayer was greatly reduced, so making it less explosive a political issue with Liberals. Secondly, the occupation became more secure, not just because it evidently benefited Egypt, but it also meant Germany and France, the two other powers that managed Egypt's debt, could no longer exert leverage since new loans were no longer required. Thus, Britain after 1888 was no longer as dependent on friendly gestures from Austria, Italy, or most importantly, Germany to maintain its position in the Near East. Even so, there was still the possibility that France and Germany may unite to force Britain's evacuation from Egypt. To stop this, Salisbury turned to Africa. The occupation of Egypt had triggered a panic known as the Scramble for Africa among European powers, concerned they might miss out on their own patch of barren desert. Salisbury decided Britain could appease France and Germany's interests by not contesting colonisation efforts in specific regions, and so lessen the likelihood of the two uniting in common cause against Britain. The problem Salisbury faced here was that European colonisation was increasingly taking on a life of its own. As the hinterland of Africa became accessible to Europeans for the first time, rival groups of traders, missionaries, and private imperialists were soon jostling with each other and scrambling for treaties granting commercial, mineral, or religious rights. Worse still, they were remarkably deft at rallying public support at home for ventures easily repackaged as crusades against slavery or for the promotion of Christianity through commerce. Salisbury detested these groups. A missionary, he muttered, was a religious Englishman with a mission to offend the religious feelings of the natives. To stop them dragging Britain into unwanted wars and alliances with either Germany or France over their colonial ventures, he decided Africa would have to be partitioned into equitable spheres of interest between the European powers. Even this came with complexities, for his plans often met with resistance from on-the-ground empire builders like Cecil Rhodes, the ruthless and energetic South African diamond magnate, who seemed determined to set up as many diplomatic tripwires for Salisbury as was humanly possible. Their effectiveness in rallying public support meant Salisbury was forced into pressing forward their claims in areas he may otherwise have avoided out of fear of angering another power. He mixed the conciliation of Germany by exchanging Heligoland for Zanzibar with the brutal coercion of Portugal, dismissing their pretensions to what would become Rhodesia with a growl in favour of Rhodes. The contest with France in Africa was even less straightforward. Salisbury had to ensure the French didn't hem in British interests on the West African coast, but also needed to avoid a direct military clash between them and the ambitious colonist on the ground, George Goldie. He likewise faced a problem in the Sudan, nominally a part of Egypt, but then in rebellion under the fanatical Mahdi. For the first few years of his premiership, Salisbury had been content to rely on the Mahdi to keep French influence out, but by the 1890s Paris was becoming increasingly aggressive in the region, their domination of which would completely unhinge the British position in Egypt. Salisbury dealt with these dual flashpoints masterfully, despite sabre-rattling on both sides of the channel, with the French pursuing the vexing strategy of upping their demands any time they obtained a concession, whilst in Whitehall, Chamberlain and Curzon tried to outdo each other in making the flesh creep. Salisbury largely achieved the petition he wanted in West Africa without military confrontation. In the Sudan, his victory was even more total. France attempted to claim the region with an expedition in 1898. In response, Salisbury sent an Anglo-Egyptian army to finally crush the Mahdi, which it successfully did. The British and much smaller French force then met at Fashoda, but Salisbury held his nerve and the French dropped the claim, securing the Sudan for Britain. In the words of John Darwin, Salisbury's triumph had been threefold. He had secured Britain's position in Egypt, the strategic hinge of Anglo-Indian defence, without drawing down on his head a continental coalition. The price he had paid in African claims had been surprisingly light, guarding his flank against an outcry at home. Above all, he had avoided the diplomatic and military setbacks that dogged Disraeli and Gladstone. Considering the near-disastrous position he had inherited in 1886, Salisbury's achievement is all the more remarkable. Never again in history would a single man, often working in secret from an office at his country estate with only a close group of advisors, pull off such a complete diplomatic victory. Britain and France's quarrel wasn't totally ended at Fashoda, but the French generally understood that Egypt would remain British for the foreseeable future, despite Britain's increasingly unbelievable assurances the occupation was temporary. The dispute was finally settled with the 1904 Entente Cordiale, but the groundwork had been laid by Salisbury's earlier triumph. In the longer term, the consolidation of the Egyptian occupation meant Britain could begin to abandon its long-time and increasingly onerous policy of defending the route to India by propping up Ottoman rule of the Straits. Instead, after 1887, Salisbury was prepared to fall back on Egypt as a check on Russia. On the other hand, indulging Rhodes's expansionist ambitions, though probably the only realistic option for Salisbury at the time, meant tensions with the Boer states increased dramatically. Until then, British policy in South Africa had been focused around containing the Transvaal's imperialism. Now, the placation of Rhodes meant his appetite for a direct confrontation grew. The stage for the war that very nearly destroyed all of Salisbury's achievements had been set.